She had seen the world. From red carpets to war zones, Angelina Jolie was no stranger to dramatic contrasts. But nothing prepared her for what she felt when she stepped into a Muslim country, not just as an actress or a public figure, but as a human being seeking to understand. She arrived with an open heart, but still, she carried the weight of narratives she'd heard over the years. Stories of oppression, hardship, and a faith misunderstood by many in the West. What she found, however, wasn't fear or darkness. It was something rare, something the world doesn't often talk about. She found peace. It wasn't just peace in the surroundings, though the simplicity of life touched her. It wasn't just in the hospitality, though strangers welcomed her like family. It was in the way people carried themselves, with a quiet dignity that radiated from something much deeper than circumstance. In places where life was tough, where resources were scarce and stories of loss were common, she found smiles that didn't fade. She met children who had seen more pain than most adults, yet their eyes carried a sparkle of hope. She met mothers who had lost everything, yet whispered words of gratitude. And she saw men who had no control over their future still drop everything at the sound of prayer, turning towards something greater. That's what shook her. Not the hardship, but the strength in it. Not the silence, but the faith behind it. She wasn't watching a religion from the outside anymore. She was witnessing Islam from the inside, from the hearts of those who lived it. And it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was calm, consistent, and deeply rooted. She began to see that what the world often calls submission in Islam wasn't weakness. It was a powerful kind of surrender, a kind that didn't take away dignity, it gave it. A kind that didn't chain people, it freed them from fear. No camera could capture the moment she stood still watching a group of refugees pause their struggle just to pray. No headline could describe what she felt when a child offered her a piece of bread with joy, despite having little to eat. These were not the stories the world told her about Muslims. These were not the images flashed on television or discussed in boardrooms. This was different. And for the first time, she realized how different reality was from the narrative. Angelina didn't walk away from that visit with all the answers, but she walked away with questions she never thought she'd ask. She didn't come to preach, she came to witness. And what she witnessed didn't just surprise her, it moved her. Because when you strip away the noise, the politics, and the stereotypes, what remains is something pure. A connection between the human heart and its creator. A lifestyle that teaches patience in pain, gratitude in loss, and humility in success. This wasn't about conversion. It wasn't about headlines. It was about a shift. A shift in understanding, in perception, and in soul. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not a lecture, not a debate, but a single moment when your heart feels something real. And for Angelina Jolie, that moment happened in a place far away from Hollywood, but closer to the truth than she had ever imagined. She stepped off the plane expecting to see pain. Angelina Jolie had traveled to many troubled parts of the world, but this trip felt different. The news, the media, the world she came from had painted a harsh image of the Muslim world, one of oppression, chaos, and fear. But as her feet touched the ground and she began to walk among the people, something didn't add up. The stories she had been told didn't match the reality unfolding in front of her eyes. Yes, the people had suffered. Yes, the land bore scars of conflict. But in the hearts of those she met, there was something she didn't expect to find: peace. It was the kind of peace that isn't loud or performative. It wasn't the kind she saw at luxurious retreats or in calm movie settings. This peace was different. It lived in the eyes of women who had lost their husbands, yet still found the strength to carry their children with grace. It existed in the quiet smiles of young girls who had never seen a schoolroom but greeted her with warmth and confidence. She found it in the simple way people treated her. Not as a celebrity, but as a guest, a fellow human being, someone deserving of kindness. As she walked through the streets and visited camps, she noticed something else: dignity. Despite having so little, the people carried themselves with a pride rooted not in ego, but in faith. They didn't complain, they didn't beg. They shared, they helped, they smiled. Their strength didn't come from material wealth, but from something deeper. Angelina had been around people who had everything, yet were lost. Here she found people with almost nothing, yet completely grounded. That realization shook her. She had expected to witness suffering, but she was witnessing strength. She had expected trauma, but she found tranquility. And as she listened to their stories and observed their resilience, she understood something powerful. Islam wasn't the cause of their pain. It was the source of their peace. That was a truth no script had ever shown her, no camera had captured. And in that moment, far from Hollywood, she realized this visit would stay with her forever. She had been welcomed in many countries before, often with flashing cameras and eager fans. But this was different. When Angelina Jolie visited the Muslim country, she wasn't met with red carpets or stage smiles. Instead, she was welcomed with sincere hearts and open arms. People who had never seen a Hollywood film knew her not by her fame, but by her humanity, and they treated her with the same warmth they would offer to a neighbor, a sister, or a guest. There was no performance here, just real, humble, and pure hospitality. What touched her most was how people gave, even when they had so little. In refugee camps, where food was scarce and shelter was temporary, families still offered her bread, tea, or a place to sit. They didn't do it for the cameras or for praise. They did it because it was part of who they were. It was their culture. It was their faith. Islam teaches generosity not as a choice, but as a way of life. And for the first time, Angelina wasn't just reading about it or hearing it. She was living it, even if just for a short while. One particular moment stayed with her. A mother with 4 children invited her into a small tent. They had lost everything, yet the woman smiled with grace and spoke with calmness. She offered Angelina her last piece of bread without hesitation. Jolie tried to refuse, but the woman insisted, not out of pride, but out of love. That simple act carried more weight than any award she had ever received. It wasn't the gift that mattered, it was the spirit behind it. In that moment, Jolie saw a reflection of something pure. It wasn't about religion being preached. It was about faith being lived. She realized that true hospitality isn't about how much you give, but how deeply you give it. She didn't feel like a guest in a foreign place. She felt like she belonged. That kind of welcome, rooted in Islamic values, was something she never expected, but would never forget. She had witnessed tragedy before. As a humanitarian and UN ambassador, Angelina Jolie had walked through disaster zones, conflict areas, and refugee camps around the world. But there was something different about what she saw in this Muslim country. She entered expecting sadness, and yes, there was sadness. But what caught her off guard was not the pain, but the joy in the most unexpected places. Among people who had lost homes, loved ones, and stability, she saw children laughing, women embracing, and families finding moments of light in the darkest corners. That joy didn't come from what they had. It came from something much deeper, something spiritual. She watched children running barefoot, giggling in alleys between tents, offering her small trinkets they had made from stones and fabric. They didn't ask for anything. They just smiled. Their eyes didn't carry fear or bitterness, they carried peace. Jolie asked herself, how could children who had seen war still hold on to joy? How could people with nothing still be so rich in spirit? She had seen children in wealthier nations who had everything, yet were angry, lost, or anxious. But here, amidst the rubble, she saw hearts full of hope. It became clear to her that this wasn't just cultural. It wasn't about upbringing or even resilience. It was about faith. Islam had taught these children through their parents, their elders, and their community that this world is temporary and that even suffering can be a source of strength. They had been taught patience, gratitude, and the power of prayer, not as an escape, but as a source of peace. That inner peace showed itself not in sermons or slogans, but in the everyday lives of these children. Angelina Jolie was moved, not by the tragedy, but by the strength, not by the noise, but by the silence. And in that silence, filled with laughter and light, she realized something powerful. Faith was not just a private ritual, it was a living energy. These children weren't smiling because they had forgotten their pain. They were smiling because they had something greater than their pain. They had belief, and it gave them peace. In the middle of her visit, Angelina Jolie witnessed something that quietly stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't a dramatic scene or an emotional speech. It was a simple act of prayer. As she walked through a dusty pathway between tents, a group of people laid down their mats and began to pray. No one announced it. No one made a show of it. Life just paused for something sacred. The atmosphere changed. In the middle of hardship, there was suddenly calm, rhythm, and focus. It was the kind of moment you don't expect to see in places filled with loss. But here, faith was alive in its purest form. Angelina stood still, watching, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. She had been to many countries, seen many faiths practiced, but this moment felt different. There was a discipline in the prayer, a silence that spoke louder than words. Young and old stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes lowered, hearts lifted. For a moment, all suffering seemed to melt away. What remained was peace, a kind of peace that wasn't acting, wasn't performance. It was real. That moment pierced through everything she had known. Because it wasn't about religion being taught, it was about faith being lived. These weren't rich people, they weren't influencers, yet their connection to something higher gave them strength she hadn't seen before. Angelina Jolie didn't speak during that moment, but something inside her shifted. It wasn't Islam in theory she was seeing, it was Islam in motion. Quiet, strong, beautiful, and for the first time, she understood why millions hold on to this faith, even in the darkest times. Not because they are forced to, but because it gives them something the world cannot offer: peace of the heart. Angelina Jolie had always been a seeker of truth, of meaning, of justice. Her work had taken her into the heart of war zones, through the lives of survivors, and into places where the world's noise fades and raw humanity remains. But during her visit to a Muslim country, something shifted within her. Not because of something she was told, but because of something she felt. The more she observed the people, the more she began to question everything she thought she understood about peace, happiness, and purpose. What fascinated her most wasn't just how the people survived, it was how they lived, how they smiled through the struggle, how they helped one another without expecting anything in return, how they remained calm in uncertainty. They didn't talk much about peace, but they radiated it. They weren't wealthy, but they were rich in faith. And that made her ask, what is real peace? Is it the absence of war and pain, or is it the presence of something unshakable inside, something no one can take away? In Hollywood, peace often looks like success. Big homes, perfect images, social applause. But here, peace looked like a father carrying water for his family with a quiet smile. It looked like a child reciting words of prayer under a broken tree. It looked like a mother sitting alone in silence, not in sadness, but in strength. Angelina had seen people with everything who still felt empty. Now she was seeing people with nothing who felt whole, and that contrast was too powerful to ignore. She didn't find peace in speeches or slogans. She found it in a small girl who handed her a flower and said, "We trust God." Just 3 words, but they shook her. How could someone who had lost so much still live with such ease in their heart? Jolie realized that real peace isn't found in comfort, it's found in surrender. Not in giving up, but in giving in to something bigger, something eternal. And in that moment, she stopped searching for understanding in books or voices. She started listening to what her heart was feeling, and her heart was telling her, there's something here. Something the world never showed her. Something the soul cannot ignore. Angelina Jolie didn't speak about it in interviews. There was no press release, no speech, no headline, but something had shifted inside her. The day she walked through the humble streets of that Muslim country, surrounded by people who had lost so much yet radiated such peace, a quiet change began in her soul. It wasn't loud, it wasn't instant, but it was real. Sometimes the most powerful transformations are the silent ones, the ones no one sees except the heart that's changing. She had seen faith before in churches, temples, and rituals, but here, it wasn't a ritual, it was a lifestyle. She saw Islam not as a label or a political word, but as a way of living, breathing, and surviving. She watched how people faced hardship not with fear, but with patience. How they thanked God even in hunger. How they shared even when they barely had enough for themselves. These weren't rehearsed acts for show. They were rooted in something much deeper, something spiritual and timeless. And that deeply moved her. Angelina didn't convert. She didn't declare anything, but her silence said enough. Her eyes told a story of reflection, of awakening. She had come with the idea that she would give something to these people, help, awareness, support. But in the end, it was they who gave something to her. They gave her a glimpse of truth, of a peace that money and fame had never been able to offer her. She came to offer healing, but she left being healed in a way she didn't expect. Later, in interviews, when she spoke about that visit, there was always a pause, a moment where her words softened, where her eyes held something unspoken. That was the moment the seed had been planted, a seed of respect, of admiration, and of spiritual curiosity. Sometimes that's how it begins, not with declarations, but with silent realizations. And that day, far from Hollywood, surrounded by faith, struggle, and sincere hearts, something within Angelina Jolie changed. Forever, Angelina Jolie's journey to a Muslim country wasn't just a humanitarian visit. It became a mirror reflecting truths she had never paused to see. She came with compassion, but she left with something far more personal, a deep sense of awe for the faith, strength, and peace she witnessed among the people. What touched her wasn't the grand gestures or emotional speeches, but the quiet dignity, unwavering patience, and sincere belief that filled the air. It wasn't religion being preached, it was Islam being lived beautifully and humbly. In a world obsessed with noise, attention, and appearances, Angelina saw the beauty of silence, of submission, of soulful strength. The verse from Surah Maryam, the simple acts of kindness, the call to prayer echoing at dawn. Each became a thread in a fabric of understanding that started to wrap gently around her heart. She didn't announce a transformation, but her expressions, her tone, and her eyes told a story of a woman who had been quietly moved by something greater than herself. To everyone who has ever felt curious about Islam, to those who've only seen one-sided portrayals, this story, is a gentle reminder. Sometimes the greatest truths are not shouted, but whispered into the soul during moments of quiet clarity. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If this message touched your heart, reflect on it, share it, and never stop seeking. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one verse, one act of faith to change everything. Stay blessed, stay open-hearted, and stay connected to what truly brings peace. See you in the next story.